He was a beast. That's what Norman Hunter said about Francis Lee. Hunter, the man they called Bites Yer Legs, feared across England for his brutal tackles. And even he admitted Lee was different. On November 1st, 1975, the two men fought on a football pitch. Punches flew, blood spilled, both were sent off. But here's the thing, most players would have stopped. Lee didn't. He kept swinging all the way to the tunnel. That moment defined his career, but it raises a question. Why did so many legends say Francis Lee went too far? To understand Lee, you need to understand 1970s football. The pitches were mud baths. Tackles from behind were legal. Referees let almost anything slide. Red cards were rare. This was survival of the fittest. The hard men ruled. Players like Tommy Smith and Ron Harris made their living through intimidation. They broke bones and ended careers. Francis Lee was a striker. He was meant to score goals, not throw punches. He stood just 5'7", barrel-chested, but he fought like a boxer. He didn't back down from anyone, not the biggest defenders, not the hardest men in English football, and that made defenders hate him. There was another reason, his nickname, Lee Won Pen. In the 1971-72 season, Lee won 15 penalties. A British record? Defenders thought he was a cheat. They thought he dived. So they kicked him harder, and when they kicked him, Lee kicked back. That's where the violence started. We're going to look at 5 legends who faced Lee on the pitch. 5 men who explained why he was so violent. Let's start with Norman Hunter. The baseball ground, Derby, November 1975. Derby County versus Leeds United. This wasn't just another match. It was personal. Lee and Hunter had history. Years of battles when Lee played for Manchester City and Hunter wore the Leeds shirt. Now Lee was at Derby under Dave Mackay. Hunter was still at Leeds. The rivalry hadn't died. The incident started with a penalty. Lee drove into the box. He went down under a challenge. The referee, Derek Nippard, pointed to the spot. Hunter lost it. He thought Lee had dived again. Lee Won Pen strikes again. Hunter walked up to Lee and clocked him right in the face. Split his lip. Blood poured down Lee's chin. Most players would have gone down. Would have rolled around to make sure Hunter got sent off. Lee didn't. He went ballistic. He threw a flurry of punches back, windmilling. Most missed, but the intent was clear. Lee wasn't going to take it. Both men were sent off, but the fight didn't end there. As they walked toward the tunnel, Lee launched another attack. He kept swinging. It was a proper brawl on national television. Years later, Hunter talked about it. He said it wasn't his best moment, but he also said it was all pantomime, a performance. Hunter admitted he actually enjoyed playing against Lee. He respected him. When Lee became chairman of Manchester City years later, Hunter visited. Lee joked, "Let's go in that boardroom and finish that fight." They laughed. For men like Hunter and Lee, violence was a bond. But here's what matters. Hunter threw the first punch. Lee's reaction was to keep fighting. That tells you everything. Lee wasn't starting fights, but he was finishing them with a fury that even Norman Hunter found notable. Now let's talk about Billy Bremner. Bremner was Leeds United's captain, 5'5", pure aggression. A Scotsman who played every match like it was a war. He saw Lee as a cheat. The Leeds camp hated Lee's style. They thought winning penalties by diving was bending the rules, or just plain cheating. This wasn't just one man's opinion, it was the Leeds philosophy. Don Revie had built a team that prided itself on toughness and tactical discipline. Diving didn't fit their code. This created a different kind of violence. It wasn't just physical, it was ideological. Bremner saw himself as enforcing a code that said, you earn your goals through honest play. Lee was breaking that code. Every penalty he won felt like an insult to Leeds. So Bremner and his teammates policed him. They kicked him. They tackled him late. They abused him verbally. This was their form of justice. Lee's response? He thrived. He kept winning penalties against Leeds. He kept scoring. He seemed to feed off their hatred. The more they kicked him, the more dangerous he became. And when Bremner or his teammates got physical, Lee got physical back. He never hid. He never backed down. He met their aggression with his own. The The matches between Leeds and Manchester City were described as war zones. Bremner and Lee had a mutual loathing. Every time their teams met, the tension was unbearable. Leeds played with a win-at-all-costs mentality. They fouled tactically, but Lee refused to be intimidated. Bremner's violence toward Lee was about morality. Leeds believed in the team above all. Lee believed in winning by any means. When those two ideas clashed, violence was the result. Johnny Giles played alongside Bremner. He was more calculated. But just as brutal, the Leeds collective recognised Lee as a threat. They tried to neutralise him systematically. Lee's response was simple: keep getting up, keep running at them, and, when necessary, throw punches. The Leeds players saw Lee as a provocateur. They thought he invited violence through his diving, so when they kicked him, they felt justified. Lee saw it differently. He saw them as bullies, and he fought back. Now we move to Liverpool, to the Anfield Iron. Tommy Smith. Tommy Smith was cold, calculated. He didn't fight out of emotion. He fought to win. Smith was famous for his quotes. "I do not spit at me, otherwise ambulances are required. Do that again and I'll snap your back." These weren't empty threats. Smith meant every word. He ruled through fear. He was Bill Shankly's enforcer, the man who made Anfield a fortress. Lee had to face Smith every time Manchester City played Liverpool, and those battles were legendary. The atmosphere at Anfield was hostile. The cop made it clear that visiting forwards weren't welcome. Smith made sure they felt unwelcome on the pitch too. He defended the penalty area like it was his personal property. Lee invaded it with the intent to score, or to deceive. Smith hated divers. He called them cheats. Lee was in that category. To Smith, diving was cowardice. It was taking the easy way out. But Smith also respected toughness. Real toughness. The kind that comes from taking a hit and getting back up. And Lee was tough. Smith broke legs without blinking. He ended careers without losing sleep. For Lee to play almost 300 matches for Manchester City and 80 for Derby without a career-ending injury says something. It says Lee knew how to protect himself. It says he understood the game Smith was playing. The violence Lee showed against Smith was defensive. He used his elbows, his body, his low centre of gravity. He had to, because if he didn't, Smith would have destroyed him. Smith's view of violence was utilitarian. You use it to win. Lee understood that. He didn't fight for the sake of fighting. He fought to gain space, to create chances. Every time Lee played at Anfield, his safety was threatened. Smith made that clear. Lee's violence was a refusal to accept the threat. He walked into Smith's domain, knowing what would happen, and he fought back anyway. Then there was Ron Harris, Chopper Harris, Chelsea's destroyer, the captain of the bad boys in spirit. Harris was methodical, calculated. He didn't just stop wingers, he hunted them. He had a system. He studied his opponents. He knew their moves. He said he never forgot a face. Lee's face was one he saw often, and Harris made sure Lee remembered him too. When Manchester City played Chelsea, Harris and Lee were constantly in battle. These weren't random encounters. Harris prepared for them. He knew Lee's style. He knew about the diving. He knew about the penalties. So Harris had a plan. Hit early, hit hard, let Lee know he was there. A reducer tackle in the first few minutes. Most players faded after that first hit. They'd think twice before running at Harris again. Lee didn't. He came back for more, again and again. He refused to be intimidated. That's why Harris respected him. Lee was included in lists of the hardest players alongside Harris himself. A striker on a list of hard men. That says everything. Harris and his peers saw Lee as one of them, a member of the fraternity, a player who understood the code, even though he played further up the pitch. Lee might have been a forward, but he had the mentality of a defender. He fought for every inch. He gave no quarter. Harris's violence was about elimination. He wanted to remove threats. Lee's violence was about survival. He had to endure Harris's tackles, and he had to fight back to stay in the match. The fact that Lee is remembered as tough as Harris proves it. Finally, Peter Storey. Storey was Arsenal's enforcer. He was the most feared player of the era, genuinely feared. Not just respected like Smith or Harris, feared. People called him a thug. a criminal, both on and off the pitch. His job was to destroy creative players, the ones who made things happen, the ones who scored goals. And he did it without mercy, without hesitation. Story didn't play to win fairly. He played to eliminate threats. He wanted to end careers if necessary. Johnny Giles said Story was the hardest player he ever faced. Coming from Giles, a Leeds United player who played alongside Hunter and Bremner, that tells you everything. Story used premeditated tackles from behind. These weren't accidents. They were planned, calculated. He wanted to intimidate. He wanted to hurt. He wanted players to fear him so much they'd avoid him entirely. That was his strategy. Make them afraid before the match even started. Lee was always in the blast radius. Every time Manchester City played Arsenal, Lee had to face Story. There was no avoiding him. And against a player like Story, Lee's violence wasn't optional. It was necessary. It was survival. Story represented the chaotic, lawless side of 1970s football, the side that crossed the line between hard and dangerous. To survive him, you had to be willing to fight. You had to show you wouldn't be broken. Lee shielded the ball with his body. He fended off tackles. He swung elbows when he had to, because if he didn't, Story would have ended his career. Lee's ability to score goals while facing Story required courage and a willingness to use violence when necessary. Story was a destroyer. Lee had to be a bit of a destroyer himself to survive. He had to match Story's intensity. He had to show he was just as willing to cross the line. So what made Francis Lee so violent? His physique played a role. Barrel-chested with a low centre of gravity. Defenders had to foul him to stop him. He bounced when hit. He had stamina. He was naturally very fit, but his violence was close quarters. Shoulders, hips, short punches. He fought like a boxer working the body. Psychologically, Lee was a counter-puncher. Hunter started it. Lee finished it. Bremner accused him of cheating. Lee responded by scoring. Smith threatened ambulances. Lee refused to be carried away. Lee had a short fuse. He wasn't cold like Smith. He was hot-blooded. He took personal offence at being kicked, and it was tied to his diving. The dive was psychological violence. It humiliated defenders. When Lee dived, he was calling the defender clumsy. The defender retaliated with physical violence. Lee then fought back physically. His reputation for violence was created by his reputation for diving. So what did the legends really think? Hunter saw him as a reactive pit bull who wouldn't back down, but also as someone he enjoyed playing against, someone who made the match interesting. Smith saw him as tough enough to require ambulance warnings, but also as someone who understood the game, someone who knew that violence was part of winning. Harris saw him as a persistent target who had to be hunted, but also as someone worthy of respect, someone who earned his place among the hard men. Story saw him as a rival in chaotic battles, someone who could match his intensity. Bremner saw him as a cheat whose antics justified rough justice, someone who deserved what he got. But here's the key. Despite the punches and the blood and the accusations, they all respected him. Every single one. Hunter and Lee reconciled. They became friends. They joked about the fight later in boardrooms. Smith and the Liverpool players respected anyone who survived Anfield without backing down. Lee passed that test repeatedly. Lee was included in the Bad Boys Club, in lists of the hardest players, alongside the very men he fought, men whose job was violence. That inclusion is the ultimate verdict. It says that while Lee was a striker, he had the soul of a defender. He belonged to their tribe, he spoke their language, he understood their code. And more importantly, he lived by it. He never complained about being kicked. He just kicked back. When Lee died in 2023, the tributes reframed his violence. It wasn't thuggery anymore. It wasn't seen as a character flaw. It was passion, tenacity, competitive fire. The fight with Hunter became nostalgic, a symbol of a tougher era, a time when men settled disputes with their fists and shook hands afterward. The violence was remembered fondly because it represented authenticity. To the legends, Francis Lee wasn't violent because he wanted to hurt people. That was never the goal. Story wanted to hurt people. That was his job. His purpose. Lee was different. Lee was violent because he wanted to win, and in the 1970s, winning often required a right hook. It required the willingness to stand your ground when defenders tried to intimidate you. Lee had that willingness in abundance. He was a forward who fought like a defender. He faced the hardest men in English football and refused to back down. He won 15 penalties in a season and took the punishment that came with it. He threw punches at Norman Hunter. He survived Tommy Smith. He endured Ron Harris. He outlasted Peter Storey. The legends explained his violence as necessary, as survival, as the price of refusing to be bullied. They hated playing against him, but they respected him. In their world, violence wasn't a flaw. It was what separated the weak from the strong. Francis Lee was strong. He wasn't one of the defenders, but they saw him as one of their own.